Welcome to Wheatbelt NRM in the field. Every month we bring you the latest and greatest discussions on the environment, soil health and local expert advice from right across the region, exploring the fascinating and ever-evolving world of the wheatbelt, home to plant and animal species found nowhere else on the planet, and dive into practical, on-the-ground farming insights shaped by the landscapes we work in. In today's episode, we are heading below the surface into a soil CRC project with Mehran Rashti from Griffith University. Dr. Mehran Rashti, thank you for joining us today. His research explores how soil ecosystems function, from microbes and carbon pathways to the impact of drought, compaction, and the day-to-day management decisions on long-term soil health. Our discussion will also connect us with the National Soils Monitoring Project, which is currently underway across Australia. So that is intended to bolster data for the Australian National Soils Information System as a part of the National Soils Strategy. Welcome and thank you for joining us today, Dr. Mehran.
Hello, Amy, and thank you for the opportunity. I'm really interested and looking forward to our conversation, and hopefully we can dig a bit more into details of this fascinating subject.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it as well. And I'm really looking forward to hearing all about your project with Soil CRC and what the outcomes are of that project. Is the project completed yet? Can you tell us where you're up to?
Yeah, we completed the project. So the final report is with Soil CRC. And at this stage, we trying to work out how we can use these testings in commercial labs and basically produce the testing methods for that. And hopefully we can make it available for farming system in the coming probably 1 or 2 years.
Oh, that's fantastic, because we've had a little bit to do with the Soil CRC projects. We've been partnering them since they begun. And we had another project which was on soil microbial indicators with Dr. Cathy Way and Mick Rose.
I'm part of that project as well.
Yeah, so it would be really interesting to hear how was that a precursor for this soil resilience project?
Basically, when we started to go into this field, we started with a small proof of concept project. So we wanted to see first, how can we measure soil resistance and resilience, and if the proposed concept will work or not. So starting that project, Mick was part of the initial group with, as well as Lucas Van Zuyten, both from New South Wales DPI, and also our partners from Griffith University. So when we finished that proof of concept, we found that, okay, there is a potential there. So based on what we had, we designed this current project. And in a different program, Mick designed an alternative projects, which the data from these projects can complement each other. So basically in this project, we're looking at functional resistant and resilient, which means that we're not really interested in what group of microorganisms are doing the job, but we are looking at the outcome of the job. For example, we're looking at respiration process. We want to know how much respiration we get in the field, but we're not really interested in what group of microorganisms do that. In mixed projects, they go a bit more in molecular microbiology. They want to see what group of microorganisms are responsible for specific actions and what kind of enzyme they produce and what happens when the system not functioning well. And basically the number of these microorganisms decrease or increase. And they try to generate some tests. So by using molecular microbiology, we can predict soil health. So that's the connection between these two projects. We're looking at basically the function and how it's related to productivity. They're looking at the changes of microbial communities and microbial activities and species directly and how it's basically relate to soil health.
So this project is looking more at the system rather than the individual components of soil resilience?
Let me explain what do I mean by soil resistant and resilience, because everyone has their own basically understanding of the process. So for our basically understanding or the method that we propose, soil resilience is considered as the ability of the soil to basically keep its optimum function when it's heating and a stressful condition. And then soil resilient is that how fast the system can bounce back to its original condition after that stressor removed from the system. So usually farming systems try to implement, improved management practices to basically maintain their yield or improve the yield. But sometimes these management practices doesn't generate a resilient soil. So the difference that we have here, we were looking for management practices that already implemented for a couple of years. And you wanted to see in these management practices, the claim is that they can improve soil yield in good years, but are these management practices would be resilient to decline of yield if we're dealing with a bad year, like if we're dealing with a drought year, or if we have some kind of compaction issues, or if we have some kind of acidity issues. And we want to see that how the function of soil microbial community can resist against these stresses and can be resilient and bounce back if this stress is removed. So basically, the idea was that to generate a more sustainable agricultural system that can produce at least a minimum basically yield in bad years. We know that in good years, all, different form of cropping system have had their optimum and they provide, maximum yield. But the resilient soil can make sure that the yield gap is not too much if we're dealing with a bad year. But in non-resilient soil, the gap would be significant in those systems. So the idea was that we're looking at a soil system similar to a human body. And sometimes, in human body, we train the body for a specific purpose, but it doesn't make it resilient against something else. For example, we're saying people that you need to go to gym and basically do workout every day. This will give you a really nice, good muscles. But if you go to a dry condition and basically you don't have water for a couple of years, it doesn't make you basically resilient to that stress. So in order to be resilient to that stress, you need to have a different kind of characteristics in your body. So sometimes the management we do make the soil basically more productive in good years, but it doesn't make it really resilient toward the harsh condition or stresses.
Yeah, I love that distinction that you've made there, Mehran, because it's really relevant at the moment with the restrictions that we're seeing in getting diesel onto farms. And this is also leading to restrictions on fertilizers as well. So I was speaking to a local agronomist yesterday, and he said he is currently in the process of redoing all his calculations because a lot of people doing yield mapping with their agronomist. So they're looking at reducing their fertilizer inputs because they can't access them, and wondering how this is going to affect their yield. It's a really, really challenging environment to work in right now. But I'm seeing opportunities to look at those soils and see which ones are still performing under those lower nitrogen or lower NPK systems, and which ones are still providing a decent yield. I mean, obviously there's going to be a trade-off with rain, like how much rain we get, because I know there's that interaction with nitrogen and moisture. Could you predict anything in this season, what people might expect to see under a lower fertilizer input system in comparing a resilient system or a resilient soil to a not quite so resilient soil?
Okay, so to explain this, I need to, go a bit back to the concept of applying fertilizers. If we thinking like soil similar to human body, fertilizers is like injection of, a specific food source, like serums into our body. So it doesn't make us resilient. So the reason that we are relying on too much fertilizers to get the productivity is because these products are replacing the microbial activity in the system that need to generate those nutrients and make them available for plants. So basically, by applying the fertilizers, we're just reducing the diversity of those microorganisms and basically reducing their functions. So in order to have a balanced system, we are applying PKN, like phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium in the system. But the problem is microbial community need carbon as well. So in order to have a sustainable system that can be resilient against the environmental stresses, we need to have a balance between the available carbon for microorganisms and then the other available nutrients. So which means that if we can provide those nutrients in the systems, we are expecting to microbial community go and dig into reservoirs of soils and bring those nutrients back for us, because these nutrients needed for plants to grow. But because we didn't train those microorganisms or we didn't let them to do those functions in the previous years, it will take them time sometimes to be able to adapt to this condition and basically show resilience and come back. But the sad fact is that if our soil health has been declined so badly that our yield are solely, depending on applying chemical fertilizers, then without these fertilizers, it may take many years for these soils to go back to their original condition. So that's why when we're looking at these projects, the idea was that to look at ecosystem managed systems. So basically, we're trying to improve carbon pools in the system. So we try to bring that carbon to the system to generate two different functions. One, recalcitrant form of carbon will help us to store water, generate soil structure, and basically generate enough porosity for microorganisms to survive. And then labile carbon form can work as a food source to generate a balance of carbon to nitrogen to phosphorus inside microorganisms' body. So in this case, when you apply chemical fertilizer, these chemical fertilizers can be absorbed by these microorganism. And because their lifespan is short, after a couple of months after they die, these nutrients can be released for crops to use it. But in this current condition that we don't have access to chemical fertilizers, probably the alternative will be managing the crop residues that we have in the field. And basically the best option is that do subsoil amendment of these crop residues, and hopefully it can help to generate some kind of reservoirs for plant roots to dig into and reduce the impact of this decline in nutrients. Because in reality, if the system is dependent on NPK and you want to cut it completely, there is a significant in crop yield, and we can't really do that much about that.
Yeah, this is really getting a million thoughts happening at once in my mind. So, Mehran, how would you consider that say people are growing cereals, the majority of people in our area are in a crop rotation system with, say, wheat, barley, canola. Would you consider that having a legume in that system would assist with microbial activity and therefore not needing as many chemical fertilizers, and whether it's too late for people to implement that now, or whether there's the potential to plant a legume underneath the cereal? Or do you know any techniques like that help with soil resilience?
We didn't test that. I know that there's techniques, so there are common techniques in different countries, but I haven't seen anything in Soil CRC that we could basically test intercropping and things like that. For example, in sugarcane system, they do leguminous planting because they put the plant and the plant get 3 to 4 ratoons, so they can't really apply more basically organic matter to the plant when it's growing in between the ratoons. But I think it's never too late, and basically applying leguminous plants significantly help. If we can use leguminous plants that deep-rooted plant as well, so even better, because basically the nodules that they generate get deeper into soil profile. And I think if we can even not to harvest them, so we incorporate them back into the soil. So just put this leguminous plant as an investment for the next cropping to come, rather than use them as a cash crop and try to harvest them and basically generate profit out of them.
Yeah, so it's probably something that needs to be a part of people's program ongoing. And I know that in our area, lupins have often been a part of the system, but they're just not financially viable. Like you say, it's something that you have to factor into your system to be paid for by other cash crops, because people aren't actually they're more of a feedstock for your sheep system. And obviously the nitrogen as well. People are well aware of that. One thing that we have got in our advantage listening to you talk about stubble, most people now retain their stubble and seed directly into their stubble. Do you think this will help people with their soil resilience in this year where they're not able to access chemical fertilizers as easily? Do you think that will help, having that carbon, that labile carbon in the system will help buffer the system and make it more resilient through this time when we're not going to have access to fertilizers?
Definitely, it can contribute to that. But we need to keep in mind that the resilience is not something that generates over months. So the resilience is something that generates over a couple of years. But it has to start from somewhere. But this is a really good practice. We saw improvement in the soil resilience when we had a basic crop residue amendment or minimum tillage for a couple of years. So probably this is a good cause to start the improved management practices, and hopefully they will see the impact in the short term if we have enough rainfall, and if not, then probably it's going to contribute for the next year. But I really encourage them, if it's possible. I know that it's going to be a bit more expensive, but if they can do subsoil amendment, so basically put these stubbles a bit deeper into soil profile, like 20-25 centimeter deeper. So probably it will provide more stability for microbial community deeper in the soil surface. Because most of the time when we analyze things, we're looking at the top 10 centimeter of the soil, but in reality, the most important part of the soil that affect your yield is below 10 centimeters. When you get into the root zone, something between 10 to 25, 30 centimeters, they have more effect on your yield. So basically, if you want to have a good microbial community, good resilient soil, you better to invest a bit deeper into soil profile rather than the soil surface, because investing on soil surface is like gambling. Because if you have a really good year, so assuming that, for example, we get a lot of rain this year, anything we put on the soil surface will be consumed by microorganisms. Everything will be gone. So we have a fantastic year this year with a really good year, but we haven't basically put anything for the next year or the year after, that we may not have this luxury. So I'm thinking, if we have the ability to put them a bit deeper in soil profile, that would give you a better outcome in the long run. But if you're looking for a short-term solution that work right now for this season, yes, that's a good option. So put the plant residues on the surface and then put your seeds in the between.
That's interesting how that dovetails into the National Soils Monitoring Project, which we are undertaking at the moment. We've just completed our first 45 samples, so we're 10% of our way to 449 sites. So yeah, that we're undertaking that project in the southwest of Western Australia's agricultural areas over the next 2 years. So we've started on cropping sites. So we're starting to see, some patterns in cropping sites. But as a part of the project, we're taking biological samples. None of them have been analysed yet, but we're taking samples at the layer 0 to 10 centimetres and then the layer 20 to 30 centimetres, taking two separate. So is that the intention of that? I didn't understand how we were taking topsoil and subsoil microbial analysis. Is that what that's all about? So showing the resilience at depth?
Yes. So basically what you see at the soil surface can change really significantly depending on what is available on the soil surface. So basically we like microbial community to be abundant. We like to keep their diversity, and the topsoil is the place for them to thrive. But as we go deeper into soil profile, we get more interaction of the root system with the available carbon pools, and we get basically soil structure get into effect. So in those areas, we like to have some kind of carbon storage. So for example, the reason that, we're struggling too much with carbon sequestration over the past many years is that carbon is both a food source for microorganisms and a base for soil structure. So basically you have a commodity in hand that you want microorganisms to use it to thrive. At the same time, you don't want it to use too much to leave something for the soil structure to generate. So which means that we need to have a balance between the soil carbon that we provide for microbial activity and the soil carbon that we provide for soil structure and aggregate stability. So when we have a good microbial community in the soil surface, which means that if for some stressful condition, one of these, species become low in their population or abundance, the other species can basically stand up and get the job done, or something that we call it as a functional redundancy. So if something goes down, the other will take its place. So that's important. That's why we're always looking at the topsoil to see what kind of capacity we have in microbial community for their activity. But the story at 20 to 30 centimeter would be really different, because as you go from the topsoil toward the deeper soil profile, the microbial community decrease, and also the species basically change significantly. So in the soil surface, you have more aerobic functions. As we go deeper in soil profile, the function becomes more anaerobic. At the same time, we want those microorganisms to not eat everything. So basically provide some recalcitrant form of carbon that can generate those aggregate stability around the root system. So basically, when the roots produce their exudate and their enzymes, they can have access to the nutrients they need, and they can capture the nutrients. So later on, this will give us a pumping, basically effect. So we tried this. It's not part of this project. We did in another project in sugarcane system. We applied our organic amendment at 30 centimeter below the surface. And we saw that, okay, in harsh environment, in that case, we had acidity issue. We saw that the plant roots will cluster around these, organic amendments. So basically means that they don't need to go around and look for different food sources, because they have everything available when they are. And then over time, they could use these nutrients to build their body mass. And then after harvest, those nutrients would come back to the soil surface. So instead of applying everything to the soil surface for microorganisms to break it down within a year and basically lose it to the atmosphere, like in terms of carbon dioxide and basically nitrous oxide, we put them down into soil profile, and it took 3-4 years for their nutrients to pump back to the soil surface and gradually consumed by microorganisms.
So that's more of a long-term natural fertilizing system. How did you do that? What would be some options for people? Is that things like green manuring and doing a green manure crop? Or how would you actually technically get that soil organic matter at depth?
So when they do their tillage, so they, especially when I found that in your area, you have, for example, some compaction issues. So when you want to break those compaction, so at the same time, you can apply this organic amendment at depth and then basically cover the soil on top of that. So in this case, you don't need to apply it to the whole field. We only apply it below the place that basically we do planting, and the roots will have access to that.
Okay, yeah, there is a lot of soil amelioration. It's sort of gained traction over the last 10 years in our systems because people are seeing a lot of things that can be fixed by ameliorating your soil properly. So we've got a lot of sand plain, and in those sand plains, non-wetting is actually a huge issue. So a lot of areas, they were the main areas that started doing soil amelioration processes, and often claying. They would try and access clay. If a property has got clay at depth, they would delve that clay up and mix it into the sandy topsoil, and that, increases water holding capacity. Another reason why is obviously compaction, like you mentioned, is a huge part of a reason to ameliorate. So what I'm seeing with what you're talking about now is probably another thing to think about when you're either deep ripping your soils to break up compaction, or you're delving your soils to bring up clay and mix into the topsoil. So you're saying adding a natural fertilizer, so say like a compost or something? Are you saying add a compost into that? Or would you just plant?
Mixing with your chemical fertilizer.
Okay.
So let's look it that way. So if your soil is not ready to accept the nutrients, which means that when you apply the fertilizers, some of them are slow release, but the thing is that they gradually release to the system, and we're hoping that the plant's roots are ready to capture them because they can't stay in the system as they are. They either would be like in high rainfall seasons, they would be leached down in basically dry conditions. Sometimes, they're not accessible by roots. And the thing is that if plants directly don't get access to them, they can't use them. And in a short period of time, they become unavailable for plants. The idea is that when we are applying these chemical fertilizers, if we can incorporate them in a microbial body mass, then they can remain in the system for a longer period of time, and we're generating our own slow release fertilizers. So in this case, for example, in the trial that we had a mixture of organic amendment and chemical fertilizers in the lower dose that you apply on the soil surface. Because when you're applying at the soil surface, for example, you apply nitrogen fertilizers, your hope is that if 50% of this nitrogen end up in plant, you never hope that 100% of this nitrogen will be absorbed by plant because the capacity is not there. The roots are not ready to do that. And usually in these cases, microorganisms are not ready to capture it. So you're accepting to lose 50% of these fertilizers. But now that you're talking about the cost, you can't really afford to lose 50% of fertilizers. You need to find a way to capture as much as you can. And the fastest way to capture that is to basically incorporate microorganisms into process to basically consume everything you introduce to them in a short period of time and then start releasing them gradually when they turn over. Because when they eat all the available nitrogen in the system, they don't have enough nitrogen to maintain and they start to die. And when they start to die, that nitrogen gradually gets released to the system. And because plant roots already clustered around these organic amendments, they will have access to all nutrients that they want in a same place. So in this case, you apply less amount of chemical fertilizers, you incorporate them with your organic amendment, it's going to get stockpiled in your root zone. And then gradually when the microorganisms died, they can be released for the plant roots. And by that time, hopefully you reach the maturity of your plant. And this is the time that you want to generate yield and you want to have a balanced nutrients available for the plants. And then you probably can maintain your yield, even if you don't have access to that optimal fertilizer that you would apply every year, or even if you have a stressful condition by some kind of periodic drought or some acidity or compaction in the system.
So is it the carbon in the organic amendments which is helping to bind to the chemical fertilizers and preventing them from leaching? What is it that is holding that?
So the thing is, we apply nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but we don't apply carbon. So for microbial community to live, like similar to our bodies, if we eat the same thing over and over, we get deficiencies in other things. And eventually, we start to basically get sick. Yeah. So basically microbial community need to have a balance between their carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, even like micronutrients in their body. So which means that if one of them is not available at optimum concentration, the microbial community cannot grow. So the growth stop. And when microbial community cannot grow, they have food source available, but they can't eat it. So when we apply chemical fertilizers, we provide all the nutrients needed for microbial community, but we don't have that labile carbon to match with that and provide a good recipe for microbial community's growth, which means that the excess nutrients that can't be absorbed by microbial community, they get lost from the system. However, if we have enough carbon in the system, labile carbon for microbial community to thrive, they can grow faster. They can basically absorb all these nutrients. But when we run out of these nutrients, for example, we run out of nitrogen in the system in a short term, then they can't grow further. So which means that they start to die and they convert it from biomass to necromass, and these nutrients will be released gradually into the system. And that is the basic release of nutrients that can be used by plant. But in order for microbial community to thrive in the systems, we need to have good air air circulation in the system. So we need to have a good structure. We need to have water storage in the system. So these are needed for microorganisms to thrive. And this can also be basically incorporated in system by organic amendment as well. So the recalcitrant form of carbon that can't be used directly by microorganisms can generate soil structure and aggregates. So the microbes can use those porosity in the system to colonize. Because when the number increases, they need more space to thrive. And a combination of all of this will provide a sustainable nutrient source for plants to take up.
So, Mehran, is the soil carbon in a system, is that buffering the system from sudden changes? Is the buffering capacity of the carbon, is that a massive component of having soil carbon in your system? It'll make it more resilient through buffering from sudden change?
Depends what form of carbon you're talking about, because, for example, when we use carbon measurements, like, for example, if we use nuclear, basically, what you call it, NMR process, nuclear magnetic resonance process, we end up with 8 different forms of carbon. Each one of them has a specific function in the soil system. So when we say that carbon is good for buffering capacity, it's not the right term to use. You know what I mean? So recalcitrant form of carbon, it helps buffering against drought because it helps to absorb water. Labile carbon forms generate buffering capacity for microbial activities. And different kind of organic, basically aromatic form of carbon in between, they have specific functions, like they generate, a structure of aggregates, or basically they reduce the access of microorganisms to certain part of aggregates and so on. So each component of carbon has a different purpose. So if we're dealing with basically problems that need to be immediately solved, like we applied fertilizers and we want it to be effectively used in the system, we need labile carbon. So this labile carbon can balance the nutrients in microorganisms and work as a buffering capacity against the nutrient loss. But if we want to deal with, for example, drought stress, this labile carbon will not do nothing, basically. So we only need recalcitrant form of carbon to generate microaggregates, because only microaggregates can hold on to water. And if we don't generate those micropores in the aggregates, we can't hold into water, which means that in a short period of time, we run out of water. So even we have a significant amount of food for microorganisms to thrive on, if we don't have enough moisture, basically the system will collapse.
Which is the challenge that we face because, we're the West Australian wheat belt is such a challenging condition to grow. It's amazing that we grow the crops that we do, really, because it's so moisture limited and there are so many soil issues. But I do see that it's an ongoing issue with the soil carbon story in cropping systems in the wheat belt because, like you said, that labile carbon we definitely have moved a long way towards a lot more labile carbon in the system with, like, people don't burn their stubbles anymore. Most people are utilizing their stubbles to protect their soil, and no-till systems have become basically the norm. So the labile carbon is there, it's cycling, but the recalcitrant carbon, I think that's where we've got a massive issue. A lot of data that I've seen is that it's going down over time and nobody really knows whether we can stop that. In your studies, have you seen any ways of increasing recalcitrant carbon in the system?
The only way, it's a bold statement, but, like 10 years of my work shows that the only way to sequester carbon is to basically limit the access of microorganisms to that carbon. So if you go into natural systems, when the aggregate generates, there are part of the aggregates that the root system penetrates in, and in those areas, the microorganisms don't have access to this part of the roots, which means that when the plants die, this part of the roots will become part of soil organic matter reservoir and become part of basically soil carbon. So that's why when we're looking at natural environment, plant roots are responsible for sequestering carbon in the long run, rather than plant shoots or the leaves or anything that fall on the soil surface. So basically, if we want to achieve sustainable carbon sequestration, we need to put more focus on below 20 centimeter. So only in those areas we can sequester carbon. But the issue is that sometimes we think that, okay, if we put all the carbon down there, then what is the benefit for our crops? But the reality is, when you put the carbon down into soil profile and then you put your crops just on top of that, you're making sure that only your roots get access to that basic reservoirs of carbon, and the access of your microbial community get limited. Because microbial community, like, I don't know how to say it. I have a Labrador dog, and this Labrador dog is like working like a vacuum cleaner. He's always hungry. So as long as there is food available, he's going to eat it. And this is the issue I have with my plants and my microorganisms. They don't understand when to stop. When you provide all those food sources on the soil surface, immediately when you get rainfall, they think, okay, hallelujah, let's eat. And they eat all of that. And then eventually all carbon will become carbon. Nitrogen goes as the nitrogen gas or nitrous oxide and things like that. So the only way that we can save some of this carbon for future or do carbon sequestration is to minimize their access, put them a bit down, and in this case, gradually plant roots going to absorb these nutrients, bring them to the soil surface, and make them available for these microorganisms rather than they receive everything unrestricted in a short period of time and then be hoping that they're going to save it for bad days that will come 6 months later or 1 year later. I don't know if does it make sense or not.
Yeah, Mehran, that really makes sense. So what you're saying is basically we should be focusing more on rooting depth of our cropping plant and trying to encourage to get those roots down as deep as possible.
And make that area as healthy as possible, because by improving soil health in deeper soil profile, you can guarantee a top soil health in coming years. But the opposite doesn't work. By improving soil health in the top 10 centimeter, you're not guaranteed good soil health in coming years. So that's why, when the cropping system thinks that, okay, we have implementing all improvement management for first 10 years or 5 years, and then we're good to go for the next 100 years. They stop everything. But because all their focus happened on the soil surface, everything will be gone in the next couple of years if they stop their management practices. However, if they put all of those practices a bit deeper in soil surface, they would be guaranteed that this process will continue for longer term. I'm not suggesting to stop the management practices, but I mean that sometimes into financial constraints, you can't do it every year or you can't do it every time. And basically, you want your process to last longer or your achievement last longer in the system. So I mean that for every dollar that you spend, if you spend it deeper into soil profile, it will come back to you for a longer time compared to apply it in a soil surface.
Yeah, that's an excellent distinction to make. I went to a workshop last month it was about soil amelioration. Very, very well prescribed, that workshop. A lot of people really interested in this subject because of the cost of land, and people are looking at the value of remediating land that maybe isn't very profitable and potentially sometimes up to doubling their yields if they do it correctly. So I am seeing an opportunity that while people are ameliorating their land for other reasons, to also think about soil health at the same time and maybe put some carbon at depth through an organic amendment or a green manuring crop or something, just to put that in their mind to think about adding another layer to their soil health. So not a lot of people are looking at lime as well, and lime, how slowly it moves through the system. So getting that lime at depth is really valuable as well.
And so in the trials that we have done, we usually mix lime with the organic amendment and sometimes with the chemical fertilizers in lower level that apply in the topsoil. So I'm not saying that, just get rid of all the chemical fertilizers and rely on organic amendment, because this is not going to work properly in the short term. You need to have your chemical fertilizers because unfortunately Australian soils has been damaged significantly. So you can't really get rid of chemical fertilizers whatsoever, but you can gradually start to reduce the relying on chemical fertilizers and start more relying on your soil health and improving the organic amendment in the system and hoping that the systems becomes more sustainable and the reliance on chemical fertilizer decrease. But unfortunately, at least for the next 10 to 50 years, 10 to 15 years, we need to apply chemical fertilizers. Anytime we stopped chemical fertilizers completely, the yield dropped significantly. So these organic amendments or improving the microbial community is not going fast enough to replace all chemical fertilizers, because the yield that we're expecting from our land is more than the capacity that they have. So basically, we're pushing our lands for yield, but at the same time, we want it to be healthy as well. Like if you ask a person to work for 12 or 15 hours per day, and at the same time look happy and basically healthy as well. So it's a big task, but we can't really ask people to release their profit. We want them to have as much profit as they can from the land, but we're thinking that, okay, if we reduce the margin of profit a bit in the good years, that we can afford a bit more, we can basically use that to make our soils a bit more resilient for the unforgivable bad yields that may come, and we can get our profit back during those times. So one of the ideas behind this process was that making the system more, how can I say, more interesting for banks to give loan to farmers. Because if we have a resilient, system, and we have some evidence to show that if we end up with a couple of years of drought or, harsh environment, our system can provide productivity and we will be able to pay back the loans, then probably more banking system would be interested in that. And the other scheme that recently becomes more interesting for farmers is the basic carbon credit process. And in carbon credit process, the carbon that you store into soil would be managed during the couple of years, and probably every 10 years, they're going to check the carbon storage. And if you could store the carbon compared to the initial time that you started, they'll give you some value per unit of carbon that you store. And that can be an extra benefit or extra profit from your farming system along with the main crop that you're growing in the land.
So that probably leads me nicely to my Mythbuster question. A question that I'm constantly asking whoever will listen or try to answer is it possible for us to build soil carbon in a system such as the Wheatbelt in Western Australia, where we've got low rainfall, we've got sandy soils? Would you expect that that's possible in a system like that?
Yeah, so to answer it properly and honestly, each soil has a limitation. Yeah. Similar to every human. I go back to the concept that we're talking about. Yeah. So for example, my height is 170. I can't be an NBA basketball player. That's for sure. So, my mom, when I was a kid, always was thinking that, okay, if I send you to a basketball team, you will be a tall person. It took her like 10 years to realize that only tall people become successful in basketball. Not every person that go to play basketball becomes tall. Yeah. So the thing is that if you want to compare your soils with a really high organic matter and young soils in European countries, and you say that, okay, I want to sequester carbon the same way that, farmers do in Germany or the farmers do in Britain. So the answer is no. So whatever you do, will not get to that level because your soil doesn't have that capacity. But if you want to improve the basically soil health, carbon sequestration, and your soil condition, compared to where you are at now, there is always possibilities to do that. And there are different techniques that we can use to calculate the maximum carbon storage that your soil can have. Because different soil types, like clay soil compared to sandy soils, and different soil condition will dictate how much carbon we can effectively store in soil. Anything more than that will be lost in the system. So there are techniques that they can use to see how much potential your soil has for carbon sequestration. Then if you follow the improved procedure, you can get to that basically stage. But that stage may not be what you want if you're comparing yourself with soil in Germany. But if you're comparing your soil with 10 years ago, with 20 years ago, with 50 years ago, there will be an improvement. This is a very honest answer.
So what you're saying is it is possible.
Compared to where you are at now. So
Yes.
there are techniques to tell you where you're going to reach to that limit. So because some people try to do the best management practice without understanding that their soil has a limited capacity to store carbon. When you reach to that capacity, any more amendment you apply or any more, improved management you do, eventually will get lost because your soil cannot hold into carbon more than that, the limitation it has. And it's really well defined and manageable and measurable for different soil types.
So obviously building soil carbon is a very slow process. Any take-home tips for our listeners to help them maintain their systems and increase soil carbon over time?
So basically we're losing soil carbon when we're introducing oxygen to the soil. So basically when we do the tillage, excessive tillage, we basically producing too much oxygen to the soil, and this oxygen can be used for microorganisms to break down those carbon that coming out of broken aggregates and basically consume them. So minimize the tillage as much as you can. Try to manage your plant residues, apply them back to the soil. If it's possible, a bit deeper into soil profile. If it's not possible, you're putting on the soil surface, it's fine. But if you're applying deeper in soil profile, just mix it with your chemical fertilizers, and don't apply your chemical fertilizers in the time that your roots are not ready to uptake them if you apply them on the surface. And basically, any process that can improve soil health hopefully can store some soil carbon. And in the long run, the more soil carbon we have, it will give us more diversity in microbial community, which means that if for some environmental reason, one species or group of species become deactivated and cannot get the job done, the other group of microorganisms can step up and basically do the function for us.
Okay, well, it sounds like everyone in our region is doing the right thing, which is amazing.
Very good news. And to be honest with you, anytime I talk with local farmers, I learned something from them because these days all our farmers are well educated. They know what they're doing. Sometimes they need to know the reason for the practice they do because these days everything has been converted to dollar value. And sometimes something is good, but you think that I'm spending some money. Does it worth it? So most of the time that I'm talking with local farmers, we're talking about, okay, you ask me to do this. This will cost X amount of dollar. Does it worth it? If it worth it, yeah, I don't have any issue with doing that. So this is a really good news, and this is a really promising, condition that we know that our farmers know very well, and the question they ask is really targeted toward what they need to achieve. And hopefully, our scientists can provide enough evidence to provide the farmers peace of mind to apply all the available, strategies, and hopefully we get better from what we are every year.
Yeah, that's the goal. And we hope to support our farmers in that in whatever way we can. So my last question to you, Mehran, is in regards to the project, the National Soils Monitoring Project. As part of that project, I will ask the landholder a short land use survey question once we're sampling their soils. We're sampling their soils down to 1 metre, so we're getting some really good data. So what do you think are the most relevant questions that I should be asking our landholders to try and get looking at a long-term perspective around soil health? So we're looking at the biological principles, we're looking at the chemistry, we're looking at the physical properties. What do you think would be some of those key questions to ask about land use in different soil types?
Okay, so this is a difficult one to answer. So you need to keep in mind that, each specific group of soil properties have a specific function. So, for example, if we looking at an immediate, response to an issue, we always look at soil biological properties because they are the one that, respond really fast to any changing conditions. Then later on, if you want to look at a bit medium term to longer term, we're looking at chemical constraints and the soil structural properties or soil physical properties. So basically, if soil physical properties are not just or are not provided properly, or we don't have good soil structure, then we start to see some chemical imbalance happen in the system. And these chemical imbalances later on will be converted to biological problems. So I'm thinking that if in national strategy project, you're looking at the long-term process, the more focus should be that what happens in the past couple of years to damage the soil structure, or what basically the carbon loss, especially deeper into soil profile. If they had any issues with basically the depth that the root could access before, and the roots can't access these days. Or maybe I can tell you funny things. Many people don't like me when I say these days we can't find any earthworms in the agricultural systems. And that's a really bad sign. This is a sign of that your organism, not only microorganisms, but the bigger organisms are just vanishing from the systems, because the soil system works as a food chain for many different group of organisms. All of them are responsible to keep the soil healthy. So probably a soil that doesn't have earthworms cannot have a really good soil structure. And then a soil without good structure cannot have a balanced chemistry in the system. And if a soil doesn't have a good chemical balance, the microbial community would get suffered. And basically the microbial activity will affect as well. So if you want to dig into many years back, I would suggest focus on more on soil physics, a bit more on soil structure, and then step by step move yourself toward the current condition, which is soil biology.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So you're looking at those compaction issues, restricting.
These are the reasons for the problem that comes in the next couple of years. Because if you're looking for early signs, these are the early signs that, the issue. So before microorganisms get limited access to organic matter, before the microbial activity get restricted, before the root system cannot penetrate down, something down there is happening to soil structure, and something is happening to the chemical balance there, that eventually you get to a time that you see the obvious, reasons in the plants. The plants, don't go deep. Like, for example, in North Queensland, we had like 2-meter sugar canes that when you dig in, the root is like 10 centimeter, 15 centimeter. You expect it to go really deeper than that. But when it doesn't go deep into system, basically the access to the nutrients will be limited. And assume that immediately when you apply fertilizers, the first rain that comes, they go below the zone of these roots. So in some cases, you see a lot of phosphorus precipitation, but it's not bioavailable because it's precipitated in the areas that's not accessible by root zone. And basically it's there. So you measure it, the concentration is high, but bioavailable, no. It's not really bioavailable.
That's amazing, Mehran. And I'm hearing what I'm also thinking about as well is that how important the roots are to maintaining the health of the soil system and also the plant, which is so instead of looking at just yield all the time and how much grain we're growing, we should be looking at how much roots we're growing as well and how deep our root systems are.
Because when we apply chemical fertilizers, we're telling the plants that you don't need your roots. Everything is available here. Just take it and use it. So basically, it limits, plants' capacity to explore. So even, if you have a really good structured soil and everything is available, in terms of soil physical properties and chemical properties, when you apply, chemical fertilizers next to the root system, you suddenly see that the roots doesn't expand. They don't explore because they have everything they need close to them. And over the years, this has caused issues because we have compaction issues, we have other issues in the system. So the access of roots get limited. And we try to compensate by that by feeding the roots available nutrients just where they are. And basically, over time, the less roots explore in the system, the less recalcitrant carbon remain in the system naturally, and we end up with reducing organic matter. And this is what happens with modern agriculture these days.
Yeah, well, I think that's a fantastic point to end on. Thank you so much, Dr. Mehran Rashti. It's been amazing to have, I could have chatted with you for another couple of hours about this subject. I think it's really interesting to me.
It was a pleasure to talk to you, and hope that it answered some of your question and some of the farmers' question. But the unknown is still too much, but we try to just dig into that one piece at a time.
Yeah, no, you've answered a lot of questions for me too, and reiterated a lot of things I was already thinking. Today's episode was supported by the Cooperative Research Centre for High Performance Soils, which is who Dr. Mehran Rashti has done his research through. And the work is supported by Cooperative Research Centre for High Performance Soils, and those activities are funded by the Australian Government's Cooperative Research Centres program. And my project, which I'm currently digging my teeth into, is the National Soils Monitoring Project. And we're partnering with CSIRO, and that is fully supported by the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry as well. So yeah, it's really exciting to see our federal government is prioritising soil health. And this research is getting out to landholders, and that's our part in this, is getting that extension out to people on the ground. So thank you so much for helping us with our mission, Dr. Mehran.
It was a pleasure talking to you, and wish you all the best with your projects, and looking forward to see good news that you're sharing with all of us when the project's finished.